Hello, everyone. Welcome to Memento Mori Monday. My name is Emmy. I am a death doula. I've been practicing for 10 years. Today, we are going to be talking about what is a Tibetan sky burial, or as we will be getting into, celestial burial. As I noted in our Sin Eater video, if you haven't watched it yet, still watch this video now, but go and give it a watch after this. I wanted to spend the month of October getting into more of funerary customs. Been very practical, regular life oriented with this series so far. So it felt like a time to have us get into funerary customs, getting outside of our little bubble, our kind of Western society bubble. And if I wasn't a funerary anthropology nerd, I would not be here talking to you all. So let's get into it. What even is this? Sky burial, or jator, signifies a giving alms to the birds. Sky burial is a very Western term, though. It's really not used by Tibetans the way that it's really used by us when we refer to it. Again, giving the alms to the birds, like giving those offerings. It is often called to carry to mountain. So again, it's a matter of being a part of a greater cosmology. And if they would use the term with the word burial around it, it would be celestial burial. There are nuances, so I will acknowledge where we kind of diverge as we carry along. Often, the bodies of those that had passed are placed atop mountains. Birds of prey are involved, typically vultures, and it's a circle of life. Trying to make this video as YouTube friendly as possible through these different dialogues that we've been having as Western people, and hearing more about what's going on as far as how that tradition has had to evolve over time for a number of reasons that again we'll be getting into. It's important to acknowledge that while some parts of this custom, of this last rite disposition option, seem maybe grotesque, it is a matter of cultural context, and it is also a time for us to step outside of our bubbles and recognize the beauty and wisdom inherent within traditions such as this. As far as the cultural significance, as I was alluding to, it's an act of compassion and charity. There isn't the same mentality of what a body is that we hold on to in our society. When the person is passed, it's only an empty vessel. It is very much rooted in the Buddhist principles around impermanence, the whole life-death cycle. Returning the body to nature, in a sense, is really allowing it to be free of those physical confines. It's aiding them in their journey, actually, to being reintegrated and to being reborn, and actually to be able to achieve enlightenment in a way that is pertinent and desirable, again, in their cultural context. It's all about being in harmony with nature, which, when we think about it that way, a lot more of us can vibe with it, I think. There's the other layer, too, that I know a lot of people who have been resonating with this kind of option, why they find it so desirable, is that it is an ecological benefit, that it is deeply rooted in that harmony with nature. There aren't chemicals that are involved. We are foregoing needing to tear down to uproot trees, and we don't have to use any precious metals used in constructing, say, a vault or a fancy pants casket kind of thing. It really is very bare bones. No pun intended. It's Lord. But it's very simple. It's very simple. The material costs and the burden of other ecological factors, like when you are doing a standard cremation by fire, there is a carbon footprint aspect to that as well. So if we look at purely the ecology of it all, it's a win-win for everybody. Also, the vultures themselves, the scavenger animals that participate, are an integral part of this whole process. Without them, this really doesn't work. Every creature does exist technically for a reason. Mosquitoes are annoying, but they're also a food source for a lot of things. Same thing with ticks. A lot of those critters that we can't stand. But yeah, they can really be great with nutrient recycling for carcass removal, ergo keeping things cleaner and safer. If one animal were to pass on a route and then a vulture went and did their job, it's more likely to be less gruesome to pass through that than if there hadn't been a vulture there or another scavenger animal there to help do the circle of life stuff. It really does hammer home that there are so many different layers of significance for why people want to be able to carry this on. In terms of the process, again, I'm trying to make this like YouTube friendly, but monks typically will do some chanting and likely burning of juniper. It could be the day before typically to kind of help purify. Juniper does have a lot of great metaphysical benefits, most commonly around purification, protection, healing, abundance, and often it is great for warding off evil spirits, cleansing negative energy, and protecting against misfortune. I can really see the benefit of doing a little bit of preliminary cleansing as a means of supporting the person that is being commemorated in that rite, as well as there being the benefit to the people who are participating in it, the living, who are there to be present in some way to carry things on, since there are a lot of hands involved in doing this in some way or another. The work of disassembling to make it so that the vultures can do what they gotta do more easily, more efficiently, were done by the rogue yapas, sometimes done by monks, but typically by what are called body breakers. Again, seems grotesque, but there's a mentality behind it. They did believe that it was important to not do the whole act with solemnity, with like a lot of seriousness. If anything, they would rather talk and laugh as though they were doing any type of physical labor. Treating it like mundane labor was actually integral to the process. And part of that, again, is a Buddhist teaching that it makes it easier for the soul of the person who's passed to understand that it's really time for them to move on. And that in between time, when they are between our world of the living and the next life, can be very confusing. If there is a lot of sadness, wailing, grieving in that way, that it's ultimately giving them a sense of, okay, I understand. It's time for me to move on. It's time for me to transition into the next world. I can see the beauty behind not wanting to make them feel overly tied down to this world, how that would be ultimately to the detriment of the rite and to the person in that Buddhist principle. Some individuals referred to those that would participate and carry on the rituals as tokden. They are playing an important role, but they're often lower socioeconomic status. They're typically paid by the family. They're poor, not as well-to-do. They're typically getting payment from the family of the deceased. I really did find those parallels between the sin eaters from our previous video and talk in this conversation we're having now, this idea of people who are engaging in funerary work, in absolving those that are moving on to the next life as like lower rung, as like socially outcast, I find deeply fascinating. And I think it very much speaks to our sense of having these strong visceral reactions when we find out that people work in end of life care in some way, whether they work in hospice or if they work as morticians, as funeral directors, as death doulas, the sense of there's like an ick factor that's conjured up that we must be the lowest of the low to engage in this kind of work. But also, if we didn't do the kind of work that we're doing, then there'd be a whole layer of the circle of life missing between how vultures are treated, tokden, sin eaters. Just very curious how we're inclined to treat the transition from death to life as one that is a job that has to be done, but ultimately one that's looked down upon to some extent. We mostly talk about vultures as like the animal to be involved in this kind of rite, but they weren't the only animal that you can count on to support this funeral rite. There's some back and forth about if this happened before handing to the vultures or after, like what was actually the order of operations here. But if after, like vultures and then remains, they're left dry They're broken up a little bit to make it more digestible. They're ground with something called sampa, which is barley flour with tea, yak butter or milk, fly, or we have a roux. Oh man. It's given to the crows and the hawks that have waited for the vultures to depart. They get the scraps at the end. Again, there's some order of operation around like how are things done. I've seen elsewhere when I first began to learn about this 10 years ago that the samba was a part of preparing it before the vultures got around to it. I've seen it both ways at this point, so it's hard to say. So a few vulture facts I have for you. I feel so much like Adrian Vigilante from Peacemaker. Want some mannery facts? Want some vulture facts? I am so Adrian coded because he has autism. Bet y'all didn't know. Now you all know and you can't unsee it. Vultures are typically involved with the ritual are Himalayan or griffin vultures. They're both quite large, actually, and they have the typical, like, white noggin, like, eagle-looking thing. Himalayan are considered the largest true raptor, which really does drive home that all birds are dinosaurs. Very Jurassic Park stuff over here. Laura Dern and Jeff Goldblum, not included. In some places, there are several Yator offerings that are made each day. However, if there's a frequency thing that kind of goes on here, where the birds, if they're made offerings every day, they have to be like convinced to eat. They have to be coaxed into eating. According to Buddhist belief, it's a bad omen for part of the person to remain untouched or for only a little bit to be consumed or like whole parts of it being left untouched was also bad omen. It indicated that they had accumulated too much bad karma, that they had lived a bad life, and that was ultimately predetermining them to having a bad rebirth in the next life. In a sense, like they're really like, we have to incentivize them to like help to purify, help to keep the ball rolling here, to support the whole process. A ritual dance would be something to kind of coax them, to convince them, like, hey, come down, it's a ritual dance. Adorable. And just like, that's also my inclination too. But there is an opposite issue in areas where it's less common for there to be offerings made. The vultures are a lot more eager. Apparently, they have to like literally fight them off with sticks as they're being prepared with the body breaking up to the vultures being presented to them. They recognize that's happening. They're very smart. And they immediately want to descend, which puts the people doing the work in danger. So there's a very different problem either way, on either side of the spectrum. And there is a concern of even having too many of these rituals being done at one location has another type of metaphysical concern that if there are too many people being disposed of in a certain site, then ghosts may begin to appear, that it may actually encourage people to stick around and stay as opposed to moving on to the next life. So for both practical purposes around ecology, things of that nature, and spiritual purposes, it's really important to have a balance across different sites across the board. Unfortunately, it is on the decline, not necessarily for reasons around it being stigmatized. It has more to do with the population of vultures being threatened. Unfortunately, poisoning from various drugs, habitat destruction, changes in livestock management, persecution of vultures themselves are all kind of interrupting, disrupting this whole system. Scarcity of vultures plays a role on how this could even be carried out because they do the bulk of the lifting and the smaller scavengers would only take the little bit that remains. It really does hinge on them stepping in the beginning. Unfortunately, too, the other thing that I know is having a big impact on the ecological shakeup that makes it less accessible is rising temperatures, unfortunately, can make it so time is of the essence. There's also that layer too, where part of why celestial burials were very practical, very common, is that it was simply too cold to like dig and to bury, to inter somebody. They didn't want to chop down any trees. So they were going with what worked best. Unfortunately, we're seeing decline over time. The governments surrounding these sites have begun to establish more regulations to both help manage disturbances of the vultures during the ritual. And they have also begun to institute some additional parameters around who can qualify for this ritual. If any individuals had passed due to infectious disease or toxicosis, they cannot receive this type of burial because they were concerned about compromising the health of the vultures, which I love that. I love that they're thinking more holistically. It is a bummer for the family that it may be less accessible for those reasons. As far as those that are very jazzed about the idea, unfortunately, it is simply not legal in the United States. What is legal is terramation, otherwise known as composting, growing in popularity as it's becoming more widespread, more accessible, legalized from state to state. The underlying principle behind it is exactly what it sounds like if you know what composting is, but it's the idea that you're returning the body to nature, you're continuing the life cycle, that the remains are turned into nutrient-rich soil, thereby offering a sustainable and environmentally friendly method, and in a sense, also more financially accessible for a lot of people too. Time of filming in September 2025, it is legal in 14 states. So we are getting there. And I do really think that it is people trying to do their part, that we're all thinking about our carbon footprint on what we can do differently. Again, funerals are, last I saw, the average funeral was like $7,000, like a conventional funeral. Most people can't pay that. So it would provide a very good, accessible way to achieve the spiritual, in a sense, aspects of a celestial burial, but in a way that is legally accessible and also not deleterious in any way to animals, to other scavenger animals that could be implicated potentially in the process. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for sitting with me. It's been a minute since I've read up on sky burial. It was kind of moving in that direction as far as a decline, and it's a bummer that it continues to trend in that direction. Thank you all for watching. Comment down below what you found most interesting about this. Would you get a celestial burial? Just tell me things. Thank you to my patrons, wherein without y'all, this would not be possible. Thank you to my Seeker tier patrons, to my alchemists, and special thank you to my Conjurer tier patrons. I want to thank Karina, Jess, Georgia, Laura, Rachel, and Mallow. Thank you all so much for being Conjurer level patrons, being at the highest tier. And yeah, otherwise, thank you all. Let me know if you have any recommendations for more, and you have a beautiful rest of your week. Bye-bye.